Preface. Francis Fukuyama explains that this book grew out of two related problems. The first came from revisiting Samuel Huntington's Political Order in Changing Societies, a classic work that treated political development as something distinct from economic or social modernization, and emphasized the possibility of political decay. Huntington had written in the turbulent era of post-war decolonization. Fukuyama wanted to reconsider those themes after the rise of East Asia, the collapse of communism, globalization, and the third wave of democratization. The second problem came from contemporary efforts at state building in places such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Melanesia, and other weak or failed states. These cases made clear that modern institutions cannot simply be transplanted without regard to the social structures beneath them. Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands provide a revealing example. Formal Westminster-style parliaments were layered over societies still organized heavily around kinship groups, or wantoks, and big men whose legitimacy depended on distributing resources to followers. What outsiders call corruption can therefore be understood locally as the continuation of older obligations of reciprocity. The example led Fukuyama to a more basic question: how did any society move from kinship-based organization to impersonal states, individual property rights, formal law, and accountable government? The book, therefore, pushes the inquiry far back before modernity. This first volume follows political development from pre-human origins to the eve of the American and French revolutions, with particular attention to the state, the rule of law, accountable government, and the recurring danger that impersonal institutions will decay back into patrimonial rule. Fukuyama's Melanesian example also shows why institutional transplantation is so difficult. In Papua New Guinea, more than 95% of land remains under customary tenure, and political loyalty frequently follows language and kinship rather than ideological parties. A modern parliament may exist on paper while political competition still rewards leaders for channeling public resources to their wantok. The institution has been copied, but the social incentives inside it remain different. This is why Fukuyama refuses to treat corruption or weak states as merely technical defects. They often reflect older forms of social organization that survived beneath imported legal structures. Political development therefore requires understanding how impersonal authority becomes legitimate enough to displace personal obligation without simply destroying the social cooperation on which people depend. Part 1. Before the State. Chapter 1. The Necessity of Politics. Fukuyama begins from a paradox. Between the 1970s and the end of the 20th century, liberal democracy spread with extraordinary speed. Dictatorships disappeared in Southern Europe and Latin America. Communism collapsed in Eastern Europe. And electoral democracy became the normal standard of political legitimacy in much of the world. Yet this success produced excessive confidence. By the first decade of the 21st century, some democracies were backsliding. Others had become stuck between democracy and authoritarianism, and many formally democratic governments were failing to provide basic public goods. Russia, Venezuela, and Iran showed how elected leaders could weaken checks on executive power. Ukraine's Orange Revolution showed that democratic mobilization could overthrow electoral manipulation without necessarily producing competent government. India demonstrated that a durable democracy could coexist with patronage, criminalized politics, poverty, and weak infrastructure. China, by contrast, showed the attraction of a powerful state able to make and implement decisions rapidly without democratic constraints. These problems lead Fukuyama to distinguish democracy from good government. Elections by themselves do not guarantee a capable state, an impartial administration, or a rule of law. A political system can be democratic and ineffective, or authoritarian and administratively competent. The deeper problem is institutional. Political institutions arise slowly, persist stubbornly, and often decay when they fail to adapt to new conditions. Fukuyama calls attention to a kind of conservation of institutions. People become attached to rules and organizations that were created for earlier circumstances, while groups that benefit from those arrangements develop strong incentives to block change. Political decay can therefore occur even in successful democracies. He also criticizes fantasies of statelessness on both the left and the right. Marxism imagined that the state would eventually wither away after class conflict disappeared. Libertarian traditions often assume that markets and voluntary associations can replace much of government. But weak and failed states reveal what happens when hierarchical public authority is absent. Markets, property, security, and civil society all depend on institutions capable of enforcing rules and controlling violence. The problem is not to eliminate government, but to build governments that are simultaneously strong enough to act, constrained enough to obey law, and accountable enough to serve the population rather than themselves. Fukuyama calls this the problem of getting to Denmark. Denmark stands as shorthand for a stable, prosperous, democratic, lawful, low-corruption society. Development agencies often know the attributes they want poor or unstable countries to acquire, but they know much less about the historical processes by which rich countries acquired them. Modern societies suffer from historical amnesia. Europeans themselves once lived in tribal societies based on kinship, collective property, feud, and personal loyalty. The institutions now taken for granted were the products of long conflict and contingent historical development. The book therefore centers on three institutional components. The first is the state, a centralized authority with a monopoly of legitimate coercion over a territory and an impersonal administrative apparatus. The second is the rule of law, rules regarded as binding even on rulers. The third is accountable government, mechanisms by which rulers answer to a wider population. A successful liberal democracy balances all three. They do not automatically arise together. Afghanistan has elections but a weak state. Russia has a strong state but weak legal constraints. Singapore combines a strong state and rule of law with limited democratic accountability. Fukuyama also warns against treating Western development as the universal sequence. China formed a modern-looking centralized bureaucratic state far earlier than Europe. India developed strong social and religious institutions that constrained political centralization. The Muslim world found another route out of tribalism through military slavery. Europe later combined law, state-building, and accountability through a highly contingent sequence. Comparative history is therefore essential. No single cause, economics, geography, war, religion, or class, can explain political development everywhere. This is the meaning of Fukuyama's image of turtles all the way down. Every explanation rests on earlier conditions that also require explanation. To understand the modern state, one must ask where warfare, kinship, religion, cooperation, and hierarchy came from. The inquiry therefore begins below recorded history, with human biology and the social behavior inherited from our primate past. Fukuyama's concern extends beyond poor states. Global capitalism created unprecedented prosperity, but financial crises demonstrated that markets themselves require political regulation. The crash of 2008 showed that even wealthy democracies could fail at the institutional task of supervising powerful financial actors. In the United States, he also sees signs of decay when organized interests capture parts of government and make adaptation increasingly difficult. The common problem linking corrupt developing democracies, authoritarian states, financial instability, and American gridlock is therefore the difficulty of maintaining institutions that are both capable and genuinely public. Fukuyama's concept of patrimonialism is crucial here. People naturally favor relatives, friends, clients, and groups with whom they exchange benefits. Modern government is unusual because it asks office holders to treat unknown citizens impersonally. That achievement must be defended continuously. It cannot be assumed once a constitution has been written. The three institutional components can also pull in opposite directions. Building a state concentrates coercive power. Rule of law and accountability restrain that same power. Modern political order is therefore an achievement of balance rather than maximization. A country can fail because government is too weak to act or because it is strong enough to act without restraint. Chapter 2. The State of Nature. Classical political philosophy often imagined a state of nature in order to ask what political order is for. Hobbes pictured isolated individuals driven into a sovereign state by fear of violent death. Locke described individuals possessing natural rights before government. Rousseau associated civilization and private property with the rise of inequality. Fukuyama argues that contemporary biology and anthropology allow these thought experiments to be tested against actual evidence about human evolution. The evidence suggests that human beings were never solitary in the Hobbesian sense. Our primate ancestors were already intensely social and political. Chimpanzees provide part of the comparison. They live in groups with hierarchies, alliances, competition for status, territorial conflict, coalition building, and forms of reconciliation. Human beings share most of their genome with chimpanzees, but the relatively small genetic difference between the two species produced enormously consequential capacities: language, abstract thought, cumulative culture, religion, and the ability to cooperate in very large groups. Human politics therefore rests on continuities with primate social life, but cannot be reduced to them. Fukuyama identifies several biological foundations of politics. Humans are rational and self-interested enough to cooperate when cooperation benefits them, as economic theory emphasizes. But they are also naturally social, capable of strong emotional attachments and group loyalty. They have a tendency to favor relatives, rooted in inclusive fitness and kin selection. They are capable of reciprocal altruism toward non-relatives when cooperation is repeated. They possess strong capacities for rule following and for investing social norms with intrinsic value. And they seek recognition. People care not only about material resources, but about status, dignity, honor, and whether others acknowledge their worth. These last characteristics are especially important because political order cannot be explained simply as a contract among calculating individuals. Human beings create mental models that give meaning to their world. Religious rules and moral norms are often treated as intrinsically true, rather than as provisional bargains. People will sacrifice material interests, and sometimes their lives, for beliefs, identities, or principles. Fukuyama uses the human concern for recognition to explain why hierarchy, prestige, resentment, and struggles over dignity recur throughout political history. A political theory, based exclusively on economic utility, misses these motivations. At the same time, human beings display a natural tension between hierarchy and equality. Like other primates, they form status hierarchies, yet human groups also develop mechanisms to restrain would-be dominance. Hunter-gatherer societies can ridicule, ostracize, or even kill individuals who seek excessive authority. Equality, therefore, is not evidence that humans lack hierarchical impulses. It can result from active social rules that prevent hierarchy from becoming permanent. These biological propensities are building blocks rather than destinies. Human beings create institutions that channel them in very different ways. Kin preference can become family solidarity or corruption. Rule following can sustain law or lock societies into dysfunctional institutions. The desire for recognition can support heroic public service or violent status competition. Ideas can reinforce or redirect biological tendencies rather than simply reflect material interests. Fukuyama then situates these capacities in human migration. Behaviorally, modern humans emerged in Africa and gradually populated the rest of the world. Small groups became separated geographically and adapted to different environments. Cultural variation accumulated, languages diverged, and societies developed distinct norms. In that sense, the biblical story of Babel captures a real process. One human species dispersed into a vast variety of cultures. Yet beneath that diversity remained a common social nature. Political development would consist not of creating society from isolated individuals, but of transforming already social human beings from one form of organization into another. The biological account also modifies both Hobbes and Rousseau. Human beings are neither naturally solitary predators who create society by contract, nor naturally peaceful individuals corrupted only by civilization. They inherit capacities for cooperation and conflict simultaneously. Kin selection makes relatives unusually important, but humans extend cooperation much further through reciprocity, shared norms, language, and the ability to imagine membership in groups containing strangers. Recognition adds another dimension. People can fight over insults, religion, nationalism, prestige, or moral standing even when the material stakes are small. Conversely, they can sacrifice material advantage for honor or principle. Political institutions, therefore, have to manage not only competing interests, but competing meanings. Fukuyama's later discussion of religion, legitimacy, nationalism, and law depends on this premise that ideas can motivate action because human beings seek moral recognition as well as physical survival. Fukuyama also stresses the human capacity for norm following. People internalize rules so deeply that obedience can continue even when immediate material incentives point elsewhere. This gives institutions durability, but it also explains why obsolete arrangements are hard to reform. The same species that can invent new rules can invest inherited ones with sacred or moral significance. Political development therefore proceeds through a mixture of rational adaptation and deeply rooted loyalty to existing norms. Chapter 3. The Tyranny of Cousins. Fukuyama next examines the earliest human social organizations. He rejects the assumption that tribes are the primordial or natural form of human society. The smallest hunter-gatherer communities were more often family or band-level groups consisting of a few dozen people. Such groups were relatively egalitarian, mobile, and dependent on sharing. Because they lacked agriculture, accumulated property was limited. Social life was nevertheless far from individualistic. People lived under what Ernest Gellner called the tyranny of cousins, kin-determined obligations, marriage, ritual, cooperation, and much of personal identity. Agriculture transformed this world. Beginning roughly 10,000 years ago in several regions, farming supported much higher population densities and required heavier investment in land. Larger populations demanded forms of organization that could coordinate people beyond the small face-to-face band. Tribal society emerged through segmentary lineages, groups claiming descent from common ancestors and capable of expanding by adding related branches. These lineages could unite for defense while retaining considerable autonomy in ordinary life. Kinship alone, however, does not explain why distant relatives would cooperate. Fukuyama gives religion a central role. Ancestor worship turned genealogical claims into sacred obligations. The dead were believed to remain present and to require offerings from descendants. Families held burial places, property, and ritual duties collectively. Religious belief could therefore bind large groups that exceeded the circle in which genetic relatedness or personal familiarity alone would be sufficient. Tribal organization was also militarily powerful. A lineage could mobilize hundreds or thousands of people rapidly against rivals. Groups organized on this basis could defeat less cohesive bands, encouraging imitation. War, therefore, helped make tribes just as later it would help make states. But Fukuyama insists that tribes were historical creations, not a timeless human default. If the religious beliefs sustaining lineage organization were altered, kinship structures could weaken. This point will become important when he later examines Christianity's attack on extended family institutions in Europe. The transition to agriculture also changed the scale of human settlement dramatically. Hunter-gatherer populations could remain thinly distributed and often move when local resources or security deteriorated. Farming required investment in cleared fields, houses, irrigation, and stored harvests, making flight more costly and territorial claims more important. Higher population density created more frequent interaction with strangers and neighboring groups. Segmentary lineages provided a scalable answer. Smaller kin units could combine into larger ones against an outside threat while remaining autonomous internally. This structure explains both the strength and weakness of tribal politics. It can produce formidable solidarity in conflict, but because authority follows kinship, it remains difficult to create offices and rules that apply equally to people outside the lineage. Band societies were comparatively egalitarian, not because status competition disappeared, but because mobility, low accumulation, food sharing, and social sanctions limited durable domination. Hunting especially encouraged sharing because meat could not easily be stored. Moral condemnation often fell less on theft than on selfish refusal to distribute food. Agriculture altered these incentives by making land, stored produce, and inherited claims much more valuable. Chapter 4. Tribal Societies, Property, Justice, War. Tribal institutions shaped property, justice, and warfare very differently from modern states. Property existed, but early private property was usually held by lineages rather than autonomous individuals. Rights in land were embedded in kinship and religion because ancestors were buried on family territory and descendants shared claims over it. Fukuyama therefore rejects the image of an original, non-familial communism. Collective ownership was real, but the collective was typically a kin group rather than society as a whole. Justice was similarly decentralized. A tribal society had no strong third party capable of enforcing judgments impartially. Wrongdoing produced obligations between groups. Injury or killing could trigger revenge, blood feud, compensation, or negotiated settlement. Justice resembled international politics among sovereign units. Each lineage had to protect itself. Rules certainly existed, but enforcement depended on bargaining and the balance of power among kin groups rather than a state court standing above them. This organization had military advantages. Lineages could mobilize fighting men through solidarity and obligations of vengeance. But the same structure made broad political cooperation difficult. Loyalty was strongest toward relatives, and central chiefs had limited coercive authority. The tribal order was therefore effective for some forms of defense, while poorly suited to impersonal administration across large populations. Over time, the logic of tribalism could survive, even as literal kinship weakened. Tribes admitted clients and followers who were not genealogical relatives. Ancient Rome's great families surrounded themselves with clientees tied by reciprocal favors. Political machines in modern cities and patronage systems in contemporary democracies reproduce the same basic structure. Leaders distribute resources to supporters who return loyalty and votes. Fukuyama therefore uses tribalism in an expanded sense to identify personalistic networks that substitute reciprocal obligation for impersonal public rules. The political problem of moving beyond kinship is never solved permanently. Patrimonial relationships continually return inside institutions that appear formally modern. Feud illustrates the logic of this decentralized justice. If one lineage kills a member of another, the injured group must retaliate or negotiate compensation, because no neutral police force guarantees enforcement. The threat of revenge creates order, but it can also generate cycles of violence extending across generations. Similar logic governs property. A person's claim is secure because relatives defend it, not because a cadastral registry and court stand behind an individual owner. Fukuyama's comparison to modern international relations is deliberate. Tribes behave like small sovereign units in a system without a world government. The modern state changes this relationship by monopolizing legitimate violence and making third-party enforcement possible. It can therefore suppress private vengeance, but only after people accept the state's right to overrule their kin. The persistence of patron-client politics shows that modernization does not automatically erase this logic. A politician who exchanges jobs, favors, or targeted benefits for support behaves differently from an official applying universal rules, even if elections and bureaucracies formally exist. Fukuyama treats the move from personal reciprocity to impersonal public administration as one of the hardest and most reversible achievements in political history. Agriculture made these questions sharper because property became harder to abandon. A field improved over generations. A herd, an irrigation channel, or an ancestral burial ground tied a group to territory. Kinship rules, therefore, became mechanisms for deciding who could inherit, use, defend, and transfer valuable resources. The political significance is that property rights emerged inside social institutions long before modern states created land registries. Later governments had to transform collective and overlapping lineage claims into more individual and alienable forms, rather than invent property from nothing. Chapter 5. The Coming of the Leviathan. A state differs from tribal society because it possesses centralized authority, territorial jurisdiction, social stratification, a monopoly of legitimate coercion, and specialized institutions capable of enforcing rules beyond kinship. The puzzle is how the first such states arose. Once one state exists, competitive state formation is easy to understand. Neighboring societies must imitate its organization or risk conquest. The harder question is pristine state formation, the first transition from tribal organization to centralized government. Fukuyama reviews several theories. Social contract explanations capture the possibility that people accept stronger authority in exchange for order. Irrigation theories argue that large water control projects required centralized administration, but Fukuyama considers them too narrow to explain the historical record. Population pressure matters because dense settlement reduces the possibility of simply moving away from conflict. War is especially important because military competition rewards larger, more disciplined, tax-capable organizations. Geographic circumscription can intensify this effect when populations cannot easily escape conquest or subordination. The absence of states in many regions also requires explanation. Parts of Africa historically combined low population density with difficult terrain and limited agricultural productivity. Under those conditions, rulers faced high costs in projecting authority, while communities could often evade domination by moving. Similar factors helped preserve tribal organization in parts of Oceania and upland Asia. State formation was therefore not an inevitable stage reached everywhere at the same speed. China provides Fukuyama's clearest early case. Its state did not arise because of a single hydraulic project or religious revelation. Prolonged warfare gradually consolidated thousands of political units, encouraged taxation and mass armies, rewarded professional administrators, and weakened kinship as the organizing principle of government. In China, as Charles Tilly would later say of Europe, war made the state, and the state made war. No single theory explains pristine state formation everywhere. Fukuyama accepts elements of several. Population pressure matters because dense settlement makes exit harder. Warfare matters because organized coercion rewards centralization. Geographic circumscription matters when mountains, deserts, or other barriers prevent defeated populations from escaping. Religious authority may legitimate hierarchy. Irrigation can strengthen states where coordination is necessary, but large hydraulic works are not a universal cause. The important point is interaction. Once population density, territorial constraints, and warfare create opportunities for durable domination, chiefs can build tax and administrative systems that become self-reinforcing. The first state then transforms the regional competitive environment. Neighboring tribes must either imitate it or be absorbed, which is why state formation can accelerate rapidly after the initial breakthrough. The African comparison reinforces the importance of population density. Where people were sparse and land abundant, rulers had difficulty taxing mobile subjects or forcing them to remain within fixed boundaries. Authority could be evaded rather than confronted. Regions with denser agricultural populations were more likely to support centralized states. Political geography, therefore, shaped the relative bargaining power of rulers and communities long before modern borders were drawn. Part 2. State Building. Chapter 6. Chinese Tribalism. Ancient China allows Fukuyama to observe the long transition from kinship-based politics to the first precociously modern state. The Xia and Shang political units are better understood as chiefdoms than as full states. Authority was hierarchical, but rulers governed through families and lineages. Political office, military obligation, religion, and landholding were deeply entangled with ancestry. Chinese civilization therefore began from the same patrimonial foundations found elsewhere. The importance of family remained one of the great continuities of Chinese history. Agnatic lineages organized descent through the male line, maintained ancestor worship, transmitted property, and structured obligations. This created a persistent tension between family and state. A ruler seeking impersonal officials wanted loyalty directed toward public authority, while Confucian morality would later treat family obligation as a central ethical duty. The Zhou conquest of the Shang expanded a feudal or patrimonial order. The Zhou king distributed territories to relatives and allied lineages who governed local domains. Authority was therefore layered rather than centrally administered. Local rulers owed allegiance upward, but they maintained their own forces and hereditary claims. What historians often call the early Zhou states were not yet states in Fukuyama's Weberian sense, because political authority remained inseparable from kinship and personal lordship. This arrangement nevertheless created the arena in which true state building would occur. As Zhou authority weakened and local units fought one another more intensely, survival increasingly depended on institutions capable of mobilizing people and resources beyond the aristocratic lineage. The long Chinese transition would therefore become a struggle between the deeply rooted family and a state seeking to make administration impersonal. The Zhou order illustrates how patrimonial rule can look sophisticated while remaining fundamentally familial. Offices were granted to relatives, authority was negotiated through personal loyalties, and lords could not simply dismiss powerful ministers whose lineage had its own followers. Political disputes, therefore, tended to involve entire families rather than isolated officials. As warfare intensified, this became increasingly costly. A ruler who needed reliable taxation and soldiers could not tolerate autonomous lineages indefinitely. The transformation that follows is thus not merely an increase in size. It is a change in the principle of political organization, from government as an extension of the ruler's family to offices whose authority derives from the state itself. This familial foundation helps explain why later legalist reforms had to be so aggressive. The state was not replacing political emptiness. It was challenging institutions that already organized property, ritual, protection, and identity. Kinship survived because it performed functions people valued. Even China's unusually strong state would never eliminate the family as a rival source of loyalty, which is why repatrimonialization remained a recurring danger. Chapter 7. War and the Rise of the Chinese State. The decline of Zhou authority produced centuries of intense military competition, and Fukuyama treats that competition as the decisive force behind Chinese state building. Warfare changed not simply borders but institutions. Armies expanded from aristocratic chariot forces into mass infantry organizations. States had to register households, survey land, tax agriculture more systematically, provision soldiers, and promote capable commanders rather than rely exclusively on noble birth. Meritocracy first became a military necessity. An army that favored relatives over competent officers risked destruction. The administrative apparatus needed to support war then spilled into civilian government. The western state of Qin pushed these innovations furthest. Reformer Xiangyang deliberately attacked the social power of the extended family and hereditary aristocracy. Qin sought to reorganize households into small units directly responsible to the state, register land and population, reward military achievement, and punish failure with severe consistency. The purpose was political as much as economic. A ruler could mobilize resources more effectively if subjects were connected individually to the state, rather than protected by powerful lineages. Legalism supplied the ideology for this transformation. Writers such as Han Fei argued that rulers should govern through clear laws, rewards, punishments, and bureaucratic control, rather than trust the virtue of officials or the morality of families. Confucianism represented the rival vision. It regarded social order as rooted in cultivated moral relationships, especially family obligations, and feared a state that tried to replace moral authority with impersonal coercion. Fukuyama sees the tension between legalism and Confucianism as one of the enduring themes of Chinese political history. The result of military competition was extraordinary political modernization. By the 3rd century BC, Chinese states possessed bureaucracies, tax systems, mass armies, and increasingly impersonal recruitment at a time when most of Europe remained organized in much less centralized forms. Yet this political modernization did not automatically produce modern economic growth or an individualistic society. The state could smash aristocratic privileges without eliminating kinship as a source of identity. Nor did bureaucratic rationalization generate capitalism on its own. State capacity, Fukuyama stresses, is a necessary element of development, but never a sufficient explanation for all the others. The comparison with Europe is central. Both ancient China and early modern Europe experienced state systems driven by war, but China ultimately consolidated into one empire, while Europe remained divided among competing sovereign states. Geography, the sequence of conquest, and institutional choices all mattered. Qin victory demonstrated the power of centralized administration, but the very severity of its state-building project also created the conditions for its rapid collapse. The institutional revolution was visible in concrete administrative practices. States began taxing land directly, conducting cadastral surveys, registering populations, organizing peasant households into units responsible for taxation and military service, and giving land or rank to men rewarded for performance in war. The old aristocracy was literally depleted by generations of conflict, opening opportunities for the Shi, a lower stratum of educated or military men who could rise through service. Qin radicalized the trend by making the individual household, rather than the lineage, the basic object of state administration. Fukuyama stresses that this was not modernization produced by enlightened theory. It was an adaptation forced by survival in a competitive environment. Legalism later gave ideological coherence to institutions that warfare had already made useful. Fukuyama cautions that military competition does not generate identical outcomes everywhere. War promotes state building only when rulers can actually extract resources, and when defeat rewards more centralized organization. China's long interstate struggle created unusually powerful selection pressure. Once trend combined mass mobilization with administrative rationalization, rivals faced a model difficult to resist without imitation. Chapter 8. The Great Han System. The Qin unification created one of history's earliest genuinely centralized bureaucratic states. The empire was divided into commanderies and prefectures, administered by officials rather than hereditary feudal lords. Standardized laws and measures allowed authority to penetrate regions that earlier rulers had governed through kinship. But the first Qin emperor pushed centralization too far. Heavy taxation, forced labor, harsh punishments, and attacks on aristocratic and intellectual interests produced broad resistance. The dynasty disappeared quickly, even though many of its institutions survived. The Han solution was compromise. Han rulers preserved the unified territorial state and much of the Qin administrative machinery, while restoring Confucian legitimacy and making concessions to local elites. Over time, royal fiefs and hereditary pockets of power were reduced, but the government avoided the revolutionary assault on family and status associated with the Qin. The result was a more durable equilibrium between central authority and Chinese social structure. The Han bureaucracy became increasingly sophisticated. Officials served in a hierarchical administration extending from the capital into the provinces. Under Emperor Wu, Confucian learning was restored to prestige, and a state academy trained prospective officials. This became an early ancestor of the later civil service examination system. Literacy and education created barriers that favored elite families, and personal recommendation remained important, so the system was never fully meritocratic. Even so, it represented a major historical movement away from administration as the ruler's private household. Fukuyama emphasizes the ideological importance of the Confucian bureaucracy. Bureaucrats did not possess a formal constitutional power to check the emperor, yet they could influence him through expertise, tradition, education, and a moral doctrine holding that rulers should govern for the welfare of the people. This was not rule of law in the later European sense, because no independent legal order stood above the emperor. It was instead a form of moral accountability internal to the state. The Han system therefore established a durable Chinese pattern, a strong centralized state staffed by educated officials, combined with a family-centered society and a Confucian ideology that tried to humanize political power without legally subordinating it. Later dynasties would repeatedly reconstruct some version of this arrangement. By the late Han, the scale of administration was already remarkable. Fukuyama notes that when the registered population approached 60 million, roughly 130,000 officials served in central and provincial administration. Schools trained young men in writing, accounts, and the classics. Recruitment still favored families able to educate their sons, and senior officials could recommend relatives, so modern impersonality remained incomplete. But the principle that public office required learned competence had taken root. The later examination system would deepen this pattern. The Han achievement was therefore not the abolition of patrimonialism, but the creation of institutions strong enough to contain it for long periods while converting Confucian education into a credential for state service. Chapter 9. Political Decay and the Return of Patrimonial Government. The Han state also illustrates Fukuyama's concept of political decay. Institutions created to solve one set of problems gradually became captured by groups able to exploit them. Powerful families accumulated large estates, or latifundia, and used positions in government to protect their wealth from taxation. As land and resources concentrated in aristocratic hands, inequality increased while the fiscal base of the state weakened. The same bureaucracy that had helped suppress hereditary patrimonialism became a route through which elite families could re-enter government. Court politics created another source of decay. Families of empresses and palace eunuchs competed for influence over rulers. Officials became tied to personal factions. The central state still existed formally, but its institutions were increasingly penetrated by private networks. Fukuyama uses this history to show how patrimonialism continually reasserts itself. Human beings naturally favor family and close associates, so an impersonal bureaucracy requires constant institutional protection. Once those protections weaken, public office becomes a resource for kin groups. The Han collapsed in AD 220, followed by roughly 3 centuries of fragmentation. Great families became more autonomous, and political organization partially repatrimonialized. Yet China did not permanently return to tribalism. The memory, techniques, and legitimacy of centralized empires survived. Northern regimes created by non-Han conquerors adopted Chinese administrative practices, and eventually the Sui and Tang restored a unified state. This capacity for repeated reunification distinguishes China sharply from India and later Europe. By the 6th century, the idea of China as a single political civilization had become strong enough that fragmentation was experienced as a breakdown from the normal condition of unity. Even conquerors from outside the traditional Chinese core often sought to inherit the imperial state rather than abolish it. Fukuyama therefore describes the strong state as one of the deepest institutional continuities in Chinese history. The decay was intensified by the Malthusian structure of the agrarian economy. When productivity grows slowly, an elite that accumulates land does not merely become richer in absolute terms. It controls an increasing share of a relatively fixed surplus. Large families could absorb smallholders hit by taxes or debt, shelter estates from assessment, and place relatives inside government. As the taxable peasantry shrank, the state raised pressure on those who remained, encouraging further concentration. Fiscal weakness and inequality therefore reinforced each other. This is an early version of a pattern Fukuyama sees repeatedly. Politically connected groups convert access to the state into rents, and the resulting loss of public capacity makes reform still harder. Despite fragmentation, a shared Chinese political identity survived more strongly than in many comparable civilizations. Later conquerors often sought to rule China as China, using its bureaucratic traditions and imperial symbols. This made reunification a recurring political project, rather than an exceptional accident, and helped preserve the strong state tradition through dynastic collapse. Chapter 10. The Indian Detour. Early Indian development initially resembled China. Indo-Aryan society was organized through agnatic lineages, ancestor worship, and tribal political units. Agriculture supported larger populations and growing political hierarchy. Kingship could be justified through military necessity or through a social contract-like need for order. But around the middle of the first millennium BC, India diverged decisively from the Chinese path. The central development was the differentiation of society into Varnas. Brahmins formed a priestly class, Kshatriyas a warrior and ruling class, Vaishyas a commercial class, and Sudras the much larger subordinate population. This division separated religious authority from coercive political authority at a very early stage. In China, religious specialists remained subordinate to the state. In India, Brahmins controlled ritual knowledge and increasingly the interpretation of sacred law. Rulers needed religious legitimation from people they could not simply absorb into the bureaucracy. The social order was further elaborated into Jatis, highly specific hereditary groups associated with occupations, marriage rules, ritual status, and local organization. Kinship remained powerful, but it was now embedded in a religiously sanctioned hierarchy that could organize society independently of political rulers. Law, in the Indian tradition, did not originate solely from royal command. Brahmanic texts and customs provided a normative order that kings were expected to respect. Fukuyama calls this an Indian detour because state formation was constrained before an impersonal centralized state could become as dominant as in China. India did not experience the same prolonged interstate warfare that destroyed aristocratic lineages and forced rulers to create mass bureaucracies. Political authority instead shared the field with organized religious and social actors. This would make Indian states weaker, but Indian society unusually resilient. The political implications of the Brahman-Kshatriya division were large because law itself acquired a source outside the state. Texts eventually collected in traditions such as the laws of Manu were not simply royal statutes. They were grounded in dharma and interpreted through a learned priestly class. A king could enforce order, but he did not possess the Chinese emperor's claim to stand at the summit of both political and normative hierarchy. India thus developed a form of social constraint on rulers very early, even before it developed a fully impersonal state. Fukuyama treats this as a crucial fork in world history. China built state capacity first and remained weak in independent law, while India built normative and social constraints that made later political centralization unusually difficult. The critical divergence was therefore institutional, rather than racial or geographic destiny. India created a socially authoritative religious hierarchy, just as states were emerging, while China's rulers subordinated religious functions to political authority. Chapter 11. Varnes and Jatis. Fukuyama argues that the Indian caste order cannot be explained adequately as a simple reflection of economic interests. The system of Jatis appears deeply inefficient from the standpoint of a modern labor market. People inherit occupations, marry within restricted groups, and face strong barriers to individual mobility. if material efficiency alone determined institutions. Such arrangements should have disappeared much earlier. Their persistence demonstrates the independent causal power of ideas. Brahmanic religion gave the hierarchy a cosmological meaning. Ritual purity, rebirth, karma, and inherited status connected a person's social location to a larger moral universe. Mobility could occur collectively over generations, but the individual did not simply choose an occupation or status. Religious specialists controlled texts and rituals necessary for marriage, legitimacy, and political authority. This gave Brahmins a form of power distinct from armies or wealth. Politically, the decisive consequence was the subordination of warriors to a normative order they did not control. A Kshatriya king possessed coercive power, but Brahmins claimed superior ritual status and authority over Dharma. Villages and Jatis also governed many aspects of social life internally. The state, therefore, had difficulty penetrating society as deeply as the Chinese state. It could collect revenue and command armies, yet much everyday regulation remained in corporate social groups. This arrangement limited both state capacity and military mobilization. Rulers could not easily transform subjects into interchangeable citizens or soldiers. Education and literacy were concentrated in groups not fully subordinated to government. Fukuyama's broader point is that religion created a strong society capable of resisting political centralization. The cost was a rigid social hierarchy, but the benefit, from the standpoint of limiting rulers, was that no emperor possessed the kind of institutional monopoly established in China. Jatis also illustrate how institutions can persist because they provide social functions, even when they impose severe economic costs. A Jati offers identity, mutual aid, occupational knowledge, marriage networks, and mechanisms of local discipline. These benefits help explain why the institution could survive for centuries, rather than being swept away by rulers seeking greater efficiency. Political authorities often found it easier to govern through established social groups than to replace them. The same density that restricted individual freedom also made society hard for the state to penetrate. Fukuyama's comparison, therefore, refuses the simple contrast between a modern state and a backward society. A highly organized society can itself be a source of institutional power. For Fukuyama, this is one of the clearest demonstrations that ideas cannot be reduced to disguised material interests. The warrior and merchant classes often possessed greater coercive or economic resources than Brahmins, yet accepted a ritual order placing the priest above them. Beliefs about purity, rebirth, and sacred knowledge altered the distribution of real political power. Chapter 12. Weaknesses of Indian polities. The Mauryan Empire was the greatest indigenous attempt to overcome India's political fragmentation. Chandragupta Maurya, aided by the strategist Kautilya, built a state extending across much of northern India and into regions west of the Indus. Kautilya's Arthasastra describes a ruler deeply concerned with taxation, administration, intelligence, diplomacy, and military power. In some respects, the Mauryan state looks strikingly centralized. Ashoka expanded the empire farther, including the bloody conquest of Kalinga. His later conversion toward Buddhist moral principles and the edicts he left across the subcontinent gave his reign a very different ideological image from that of Qin Shi Huangdi. Yet Fukuyama cautions against assuming that the existence of a vast empire meant that India possessed a Chinese-style bureaucratic state. Mauryan authority was shallower and depended more heavily on local social structures. The caste system, village communities, and religious authorities retained autonomy that Chinese state builders had systematically attacked. After the Mauryas, political unity receded. The Gupta period restored important centers of power, but not a permanently consolidated subcontinental state. Fukuyama characterizes the outcome as a victory of society over politics. Indian social organization was so dense and self-governing that political regimes could rise and fall without reconstructing the social order from the ground up. This made society resilient, but government comparatively weak. From the 10th century onward, much of Indian political development came through foreign conquest, first Muslim and later British. Foreign rulers could establish states over Indian territory, while leaving many caste and village institutions intact. The comparison with China is therefore stark. China generally returned to a unified empire after periods of breakdown. India generally returned to political fragmentation after periods of imperial unity. Fukuyama does not treat either pattern as simply superior. China demonstrates the advantages and dangers of a strong state without independent social constraints. India demonstrates the advantages and dangers of a strong society confronting weak political institutions. The more desirable long-run outcome, he suggests, is a strong state balanced by an equally strong society. The contrast between Ashoka and the first Qin emperor captures the divergence. Both ruled large territories after violent conquest, but Ashoka's inscriptions emphasized moral rule and religious toleration after the slaughter at Kalinga, while the Qin represented a much more systematic attack on autonomous social structures. Mauryan administration could be formidable at the center, yet it did not dissolve the corporate organization of villages and castes. When the dynasty weakened, those social institutions remained available to organize everyday life. Political fragmentation, therefore, did not mean social collapse. India could survive weak states precisely because society carried so much of the burden of order. Foreign conquerors later exploited this pattern. Muslim and British rulers could sit above a highly organized society without fully remaking it. Their states changed, while caste, village, and religious institutions displayed remarkable continuity. That continuity explains both India's resilience and the chronic difficulty of creating a deeply penetrating centralized state. Chapter 13: Slavery and the Muslim Exit from Tribalism. The rise of Islam unified Arab tribes on a scale that had previously been impossible. Muhammad combined religious charisma, political agreement, and force to create a state-level community. Tribal armies then conquered enormous territories with extraordinary speed. But conquest exposed a structural problem. Tribal warriors could be formidable in expansion while remaining difficult to govern. Their loyalties were personal and genealogical, and they expected access to the spoils of rule. The Abbasid caliphs developed military slavery as a solution. Rather than depend entirely on fractious tribal levies or hereditary aristocrats, rulers purchased or recruited young outsiders, often Turkic, separated them from their original kin networks, converted and trained them, and made their careers dependent on the ruler. The institution resembles an answer to the ancient problem identified by Plato. How can a state create guardians whose loyalty is directed toward the political order rather than their families? Military slaves were paradoxical. Legally unfree at entry, they could rise to positions of enormous power. Precisely because they lacked local family bases, they could serve as more reliable instruments of central authority. The system therefore offered Muslim rulers a route out of patrimonial tribal politics without first destroying kinship throughout society. The Abbasid Empire ultimately fragmented, but military slavery survived because it solved a real political problem. Successor regimes across the Muslim world adopted variants of it. The Ghaznavids, Mamluks, and eventually the Ottomans would build important states around soldiers and administrators whose political identity had been deliberately detached from ordinary hereditary society. The institution became one of the most distinctive routes to impersonal state building outside China and Europe. The institution also reveals a recurring paradox in state building. Rulers often achieve impersonality by creating an elite that is personally dependent on them. A military slave owes his position to the sovereign rather than to inherited land or a local clan. This makes him useful against patrimonial aristocrats, but the system remains vulnerable if the slave elite itself acquires independent corporate power. Fukuyama sees military slavery as ingenious because it uses social uprooting to manufacture loyalty. It does not require transforming the kinship practices of the population as a whole. That is why it could create powerful states quickly, but also why the long-run problem of succession and elite reproduction would return in the Mamluk and Ottoman cases. The logic resembles Plato's proposal that guardians should be separated from ordinary family attachments so that private loyalties do not corrupt public service. Muslim rulers achieved a comparable result through coercive recruitment rather than philosophical education. The method was harsh, but institutionally it targeted the same problem Fukuyama sees everywhere. Officials naturally try to convert power into family advantage. Chapter 14: The Mamluks Save Islam. Military slavery reached an extraordinary political form in Egypt. The Mamluks were slave soldiers, largely of Turkic or Circassian origin, who eventually seized power for themselves. Their military effectiveness was historically consequential. They helped stop the Crusader states and, most dramatically, defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260, checking an expansion that had already destroyed Baghdad. Fukuyama uses their success to show why rulers repeatedly turned to outsiders who had been detached from kinship and trained as professional warriors. Yet the Mamluk system contained a fundamental design problem. The institution had been created so that servants without local family connections would remain loyal to a ruler. Once the Mamluks themselves became the rulers, there was no principal above them capable of disciplining the military elite. Individual commanders could aspire to the sultanate, creating recurrent struggles for power. The regime lacked a stable mechanism for succession. A second problem was repatrimonialization. Mamluks sought to provide for their own descendants, even though the ideal system depended on bringing in fresh slaves each generation. Their sons lacked the same training and outsider status. Over time, private interests and inherited claims weakened the institutional logic that had made military slavery effective in the first place. Fukuyama connects this to the broader question of whether states are simply organized criminal organizations. States certainly possess coercive power and can use it to extract resources. But a stationary ruler has incentives to preserve the productive society on which future taxation depends. The quality of government depends on whether political power is institutionalized in ways that distinguish public interest from the private interest of rulers and their followers. The Mamluks built a powerful military order, but never fully solved that problem. The Mamluks reveal both the strength and the weakness of a military elite detached from ordinary society. Their training, discipline, and solidarity made them unusually effective against external enemies, but political authority inside the regime remained unstable because commanders possessed similar claims to rule. A sultan could not rely on a settled hereditary principle that everyone accepted. Political succession, therefore, invited intrigue, coups, and competition among military households. Fukuyama uses this to refine the organized crime analogy. A state becomes more than a protection racket when rulers create durable institutions that make public order predictable beyond the life of any one strongman. The Mamluks never fully crossed that threshold because their own governing class remained organized around personal military followings. Chapter 15. The Functioning and Decline of the Ottoman State. The Ottoman Empire perfected military slavery more successfully than the Mamluks and created one of the strongest pre-modern states outside China. Conquest gave early Ottoman rulers unusual freedom to design institutions without accommodating a deeply entrenched hereditary aristocracy. Provincial authority and land revenues could be assigned conditionally rather than transferred permanently to noble families. The Sultan, therefore, possessed far greater control over officials than many European monarchs. The devshirme and related military slave institutions were central. Christian boys from the empire's European territories were recruited, converted to Islam, trained, and assigned according to ability. Some became janissaries. Others entered palace or administrative service and could rise to the highest offices. Because their position derived from the Sultan rather than an independent lineage, they formed what Fukuyama calls a one-generation aristocracy. The system was a deliberate barrier against patrimonial capture. The Ottoman land and military arrangements also prevented provincial soldiers from turning fiscal assignments automatically into hereditary estates. At its height, the state used these institutions not merely to maximize extraction, but to protect peasants against uncontrolled local predation. A ruler who preserved a tax base and restrained private rent-seeking could govern more effectively than competing elites interested in immediate appropriation. The system nevertheless depended on conditions that eventually changed. Ottoman expansion slowed as the empire approached geographic and military limits. Fiscal pressures increased. Firearms and new forms of warfare altered the value of the old cavalry and janissary structures. Officials and soldiers increasingly converted public positions into hereditary or private resources. The devshirme weakened, janissaries acquired families and economic interests, and the state repatrimonialized. Fukuyama treats the Ottoman case as both a remarkable achievement and a developmental dead end. Military slavery solved the political problem of creating loyal, impersonal servants in a kinship-based society, but it did so through an institution difficult to reproduce once the state stopped expanding. The empire did not generate sustained, intensive economic growth capable of replacing territorial expansion as a source of revenue. External military pressure and internal institutional decay therefore reinforced one another. The Ottoman achievement was to keep the slave elite subordinate to the dynasty for much longer. The ruler's household absorbed talented outsiders and deliberately prevented the emergence of a fully independent hereditary nobility. Fiscal and military assignments remained conditional on service, This allowed the center to rotate officials and reduce the local entrenchment that weakened European kings. Yet success itself created pressures for normalization. Janissaries wanted the right to marry, conduct business, pass advantages to children, and protect accumulated wealth. Provincial officeholders sought to make temporary revenues permanent. In Fukuyama's language, a formerly impersonal system began to repatrimonialize as its servants tried to convert public positions into private family assets. Institutional decay did not require the disappearance of the state. It occurred when the social logic the institution had been designed to suppress re-entered it. Ottoman decline, therefore, illustrates a general mechanism of political decay rather than a simple story of cultural stagnation. Institutions optimized for conquest, cavalry warfare, and continuous territorial expansion became less effective when military technology, fiscal demands, and the geopolitical environment changed. Groups benefiting from the old arrangements resisted adaptation, so institutions that had once produced strength became obstacles to reform. Chapter 16. Christianity undermines the family. Europe took a very different route out of tribalism. Rather than a centralized state deliberately attacking kinship, as in Qin China, or rulers creating military slaves, as in the Muslim world, the Catholic Church gradually weakened extended kinship through changes in marriage, inheritance, and family law. Fukuyama regards this as one of the deepest sources of European exceptionalism. The distinctive Western European marriage pattern emerged early. Compared with many other regions, Europeans married relatively late. A substantial number never married. Newly married couples often established separate households, and women possessed more rights in property and inheritance. Fukuyama challenges the idea that this individualism was simply a product of modern capitalism. Much of it preceded industrialization by centuries. The church played a major role through prohibitions that made lineage consolidation harder. It restricted marriage among close relatives, discouraged polygamy, concubinage, adoption, and levirate practices, and promoted rules that gave widows and daughters stronger claims. Many of these rules had the effect of breaking the mechanisms by which clans preserve property across generations. They also benefited the church economically because individuals without direct heirs could donate land to religious institutions. Whatever the mixture of spiritual and material motives, the political effect was profound. By weakening extended families, the church created a society in which individuals increasingly stood outside dense kinship corporations. This made voluntary associations, contracts, and impersonal institutions easier to develop. Henry Maine's famous transition from status to contract thus began much earlier in Europe than conventional modernization theory assumed. The church itself simultaneously became an independent corporate actor. Unlike religion in China, it was not a department of the state. Unlike Brahmanism in India, it developed a centralized organization capable of acting across territories. Europe therefore entered its period of state building, with kinship already weakened, and with a powerful religious institution capable of resisting monarchs. Both facts would shape the emergence of the rule of law. Fukuyama places unusual weight on the church's marriage rules because they altered the basic unit from which political organization was built. The prohibition of marriage within widening degrees of kinship forced people to seek spouses outside the clan. Restrictions on adoption and levirate marriage made it harder to preserve property within a lineage when direct heirs were absent. Rules supporting women's rights to inherit or own property further weakened the agnatic corporation. Over centuries, these changes produced a society with fewer powerful extended families before kings had acquired strong bureaucratic states. Europe therefore avoided the Chinese sequence in which the state had to defeat lineages directly. When European monarchs later centralized, they faced nobles and corporate bodies, but not the same kind of all-encompassing kinship structures that dominated earlier tribal societies. England was an extreme case even within Europe. Individual property in nuclear households appeared unusually early, which helps explain why later English state building occurred in a society already accustomed to social relations extending beyond clan structures. The sequence mattered. Impersonal social relationships developed before the fully modern centralized state. Part 3. The Rule of Law, Chapter 17. The Origins of the Rule of Law. Fukuyama defines the rule of law more strictly than the mere existence of laws. Every government issues rules, but the rule of law exists only when even the ruler is understood to be subject to a body of law that he did not simply create at will. This distinction is difficult to institutionalize because rulers normally want discretion, and legal systems require both legitimacy and autonomous institutions capable of applying rules consistently. He engages Friedrich Hayek's argument that law often precedes legislation. Customs emerge gradually from decentralized social interactions, and rulers later recognize rather than invent them. Fukuyama accepts the insight but rejects a purely spontaneous account. Political authority has repeatedly transformed customary rules into more systematic law. Legal development is therefore an interaction between inherited norms and deliberate state building. England illustrates this point. Following the Norman conquest, royal judges expanded a common legal system across the kingdom. The king's courts competed successfully with local and feudal jurisdictions. Through writs, traveling justices, standardized procedures, juries, and accumulated precedent, common law became increasingly uniform. This was not a law created outside the state in opposition to royal power. Royal authority itself was essential to its construction. Paradoxically, that process later constrained the monarchy. Because royal power had helped create a respected legal order, political actors could invoke that same law against later kings. The legitimacy of the English state became tied to the claim that government acted through law. Fukuyama therefore warns against the simple assumption that state power and rule of law are opposites. A strong state may be necessary to create and enforce a legal order, even though that legal order can later bind the state itself. Continental Europe followed a different route through the recovery of Roman law, but the deeper transformation similarly involved law becoming an autonomous source of legitimacy. The decisive institution there was the medieval Catholic Church. The English case also shows why Fukuyama distinguishes the rule of law from modern democracy. Medieval law could bind kings in a society that was highly unequal and politically exclusionary. The key institutional innovation was not universal rights, but the idea that legitimate political authority operated through a pre-existing legal order. Common law grew case by case, but royal power was essential in creating national jurisdiction. This complicates the libertarian tendency to imagine law as purely spontaneous order. Without the king's courts, local customs might have remained fragmented and dominated by local lords. State building could therefore strengthen law, and law could later constrain the state. Fukuyama repeatedly returns to this reciprocal relationship. The most durable political orders are built not by maximizing either state power or social autonomy in isolation, but by allowing institutions to reinforce and limit one another. Fukuyama also separates rule of law from what political scientists sometimes call rule by law. An autocrat may govern predictably through written statutes and still remain above them. Genuine rule of law requires a normative hierarchy in which political authorities recognize that some rules cannot be altered, merely because changing them is convenient. That is why the historical origin of law matters. Custom, religion, and corporate legal institutions can give rules legitimacy independent of the executive. Yet independent origins are not enough. Law also needs a state capable of enforcing judgments consistently. A weak legal order may constrain rulers in theory, while failing to protect ordinary people in practice. This helps explain why legal reform is so difficult in contemporary weak states. A modern court system cannot be created simply by publishing statutes or constructing courthouses. Judges must possess professional authority, litigants must expect decisions to be enforced, and political leaders must accept unfavorable rulings. These expectations are products of long institutional development. Fukuyama's medieval cases are therefore not antiquarian. They show why the rule of law is often harder to build than elections, and why transplanted legal codes can remain ineffective when the surrounding balance of power does not support them. Chapter 18. The Church becomes a state. The Gregorian reforms of the 11th century transformed the Catholic Church into a political and legal institution, with consequences far beyond religion. Pope Gregory VII and his allies asserted that the Church possessed authority independent of emperors and kings, including the right to control clerical appointments and discipline political rulers. The investiture conflict that followed created an enduring division between spiritual and temporal authority. Because the papacy lacked armies comparable to those of secular rulers, it relied heavily on law and legitimacy. Church reformers searched for authoritative legal materials, systematized canon law, and helped revive the study of Justinian's Roman law. Universities and professional lawyers emerged around the interpretation of these bodies of doctrine. Europe thus acquired a class of legal specialists and a conception of law as a coherent system capable of existing independently of a particular ruler's command. The church itself became increasingly state-like. It developed a hierarchy, a bureaucracy, courts, taxation, diplomatic machinery, and rules for appointment. Fukuyama emphasizes that modern bureaucratic organization was not invented solely by secular monarchies. The medieval papacy demonstrated how a translocal organization could recruit officials, preserve records, and govern through formal law. At the same time, the struggle between church and empire defined a secular sphere more clearly. Neither side achieved complete supremacy. That unresolved dualism was politically productive. European rulers encountered an organized institution claiming jurisdiction over matters that the state could not simply absorb. This made the idea of divided authority familiar long before modern constitutionalism. Fukuyama does not claim that medieval canon law was equivalent to a contemporary constitution, but the principle that rulers live within a normative order higher than their immediate will had become institutionally anchored. The European rule of law, therefore, has roots at least as far back as the 12th century, centuries before the Enlightenment or democratic revolution. The investiture conflict mattered because it prevented Europe from settling into a unified Caesaro-Papist order in which political rulers controlled religion. Gregory VII's claim that popes could depose emperors was radical, but even incomplete papal victory established the principle that secular rulers were not the sole source of legitimacy. Canon law then became a professional legal system with procedures, appeals, judges, and authoritative texts. The revival of Roman law at universities such as Bologna strengthened the broader European idea that law could be studied as a rational discipline rather than treated simply as custom or royal command. The resulting legal profession later served both church and state. In this sense, the church helped build the intellectual and organizational tools of modern government while simultaneously creating a powerful institutional precedent for limiting government. The resulting European pluralism was historically contingent. Neither emperor nor pope succeeded in absorbing the other, and regional rulers, cities, monasteries, universities, and courts multiplied the number of organized authorities. This institutional competition gave political actors places to appeal when one authority overreached. The later language of rights developed on terrain already shaped by centuries of divided jurisdiction. Chapter 19. The State Becomes a Church. Europe was not the only civilization in which rulers acknowledged a law they did not create. India and the Islamic Middle East also developed strong traditions of religious law. In Islamic societies, the Sharia was interpreted by religious scholars and judges, rather than simply legislated by rulers. Property, contract, inheritance, family relations, and many aspects of civil life, therefore existed within a legal order that rulers were expected to respect. This created a functional separation between mosque and state, even though Islam did not develop a church organized like Catholicism. Sultans could issue administrative regulations and positive law, but they did so alongside a religious legal tradition whose authority came from revelation and scholarship. The Ottoman ruler was powerful, yet he could not plausibly claim to create the Sharia by personal decree. The comparison with India is revealing. Hindu law and Islamic law both rested on religious traditions, guarded by specialists who accumulated precedents and doctrine over centuries. In each case, colonial or Western influence later transformed the legal order. Foreign administrators attempted to codify and standardize traditions that had previously been more decentralized and interpretive. Fukuyama argues that these encounters weakened indigenous legal institutions, rather than simply introducing law where none had existed. Yet neither the Muslim ulama nor the Hindu priesthood became a centralized political corporation comparable to the Catholic Church. They could constrain rulers normatively, but they lacked the unified hierarchy and independent political resources that allowed medieval popes to confront emperors directly. This helps explain why the European rule of law became more institutionally robust. China remains the contrasting case. The emperor stood at the apex of both political and moral order. Law was primarily an instrument of government, rather than a body of rules standing above the sovereign. Confucian morality might restrain rulers, but no autonomous legal institution possessed authority comparable to church, sharia, or dharma. The comparison with Islam is important because it corrects the modern assumption that Islamic politics was historically unconstrained despotism. Pre-modern Muslim rulers often respected property and contract rules rooted in sharia precisely because religious scholars possessed independent authority to interpret them. The ulama, however, were decentralized. No pope could command them as a corporate body, excommunicate a ruler in the European sense, or mobilize a transnational bureaucracy against a sultan. This gave Islamic law social depth without producing the same institutional confrontation between church and state. Fukuyama also argues that later Western legal intervention sometimes weakened rather than strengthened indigenous rule of law by turning flexible religious jurisprudence into state-administered codes. Modernization could therefore centralize legal power in the state even while claiming to rationalize it. India, Islam, and Europe therefore demonstrate that the rule of law can precede modern democracy and even modern statehood. Fukuyama's comparative question is why some legal traditions later became capable of constraining powerful modern governments, while others were absorbed or weakened. Western Europe's distinctive answer lay less in superior ideas than in the unusual corporate organization of the church and the enduring institutional separation it created. Chapter 20. Oriental Despotism. After periods of political decay, China repeatedly reconstructed a strong centralized state. The Tang and Song eras restored and refined bureaucratic institutions, and the examination system increasingly opened official recruitment to educated men beyond hereditary aristocratic families. By Song times, China possessed many features associated with a modern administrative state: centralized taxation, professional officials, large-scale public works, and a sophisticated economy. Fukuyama uses the extraordinary career of Empress Wu to illuminate both the strength and the vulnerability of this system. Wu Zhao rose from concubine to empress and ultimately ruled in her own name, establishing a short-lived dynasty. She manipulated court factions, used the bureaucracy, and created new bases of support. Her reign showed how much power could be concentrated in the sovereign when no independent legal authority formally limited the throne. Chinese legitimacy, nevertheless, was not simply brute force. The doctrine of the mandate of heaven held that rulers governed conditionally. Natural disasters, rebellion, disorder, and misgovernment could be interpreted as evidence that heaven had withdrawn its support. A successful rebel could therefore become legitimate after victory. This doctrine imposed a powerful moral expectation that the emperor rule for the welfare of the people. But the mandate of heaven was not a procedural check. There was no court able to declare in advance that an emperor had violated a constitutional rule. The ultimate sanction was rebellion, often after government had already failed catastrophically. Chinese rulers could therefore possess virtually unlimited formal authority while being restrained in practice by Confucian norms, bureaucratic advice, fear of disorder, and concern for dynastic legitimacy. Fukuyama rejects the crude image of China as permanently despotic. Many emperors governed with restraint, and the bureaucracy often delivered competent administration. The deeper problem was structural. Good government depended excessively on the character of the ruler and the internal norms of officials because no rule of law stood outside the state. The Chinese examination system made the contrast especially striking. By recruiting officials through mastery of classical texts, the state created a bureaucratic elite whose social prestige depended on learning rather than hereditary military status. This helped prevent permanent aristocratic families from monopolizing office. But the examination bureaucracy remained part of the imperial state, not an institution outside it. Its officials could admonish an emperor and sometimes shape policy profoundly, yet they could not appeal to an autonomous constitution against him. The mandate of heaven similarly justified rebellion only retrospectively. If a dynasty fell, its failure proved that heaven had withdrawn support. While the dynasty remained strong, no standing institution could formally announce that the mandate had been lost. China therefore possessed powerful moral restraints without legalized horizontal constraints. This arrangement could work remarkably well under capable emperors because Confucian norms encouraged restraint and competent officials supplied information the ruler needed. Fukuyama's criticism is therefore not a claim that unconstrained power always produces bad government. It is that a system lacking institutionalized external checks has no reliable defense when moral norms fail. Chapter 21. Stationary Bandits. Fukuyama now asks whether a strong state without rule of law or accountability is necessarily predatory. Mancur Olson's metaphor of the stationary bandit provides the starting point. A roving bandit takes as much as possible and moves on. A stationary bandit who expects to rule the same population for years has an incentive to protect production, preserve order, and limit extraction so that there will be resources to tax in the future. State power can therefore generate public goods, even when rulers are not democratically accountable. Ming China illustrates both sides of this logic. The dynasty governed through a sophisticated bureaucracy, maintained order across an enormous territory, and often imposed relatively modest taxation. In many periods, subjects experienced what Fukuyama calls good government, despite the absence of constitutional checks on the emperor. Chinese institutions had solved the state-building problem unusually early. The weakness appears in the "emperor problem." Because no rule of law or accountable institution stood above the sovereign, a disastrous ruler could disrupt the system with few formal restraints. Court favorites, eunuchs, palace factions, and arbitrary imperial decisions could overwhelm bureaucratic norms. Officials could remonstrate, invoke Confucian principles, or refuse cooperation at personal risk, but their influence remained advisory rather than constitutionally guaranteed. Fukuyama therefore distinguishes the quality of institutions from the existence of checks on power. China could generate competent administration because of bureaucratic traditions, education, and norms of public service. These were real institutional achievements, but institutions alone could not guarantee that the sovereign would always respect them. The problem was not that every emperor was a tyrant. It was that the system lacked a reliable mechanism for dealing with the occasional tyrant. This also complicates explanations of why China did not experience an indigenous industrial revolution. Fukuyama does not think the absence of a capable state explains it. China had many strong administrative and commercial institutions. Whatever blocked sustained capitalist growth under the Ming and Qing, it cannot simply be attributed to primitive government. The political lesson is narrower. State capacity can exist without law above the ruler and without democratic accountability, but that combination remains vulnerable to arbitrary power. The Ming bureaucracy also demonstrates why a capable state can be both impressive and fragile. Officials were recruited through demanding examinations and organized in ministries with specialized functions, giving the dynasty a degree of administrative rationality that many contemporary states lacked. Yet the emperor could still disrupt the entire apparatus through personal intervention. A ruler who neglected business, elevated favorites, or turned palace servants into alternative channels of authority could weaken institutions without formally abolishing them. The bureaucracy's strength, therefore, depended partly on norms of proper rulership. Fukuyama's point is not that constitutional government automatically produces better policy in every case. A benevolent and competent autocrat may govern very well. The institutional question is, what happens when the ruler is neither benevolent nor competent? A system without enforceable constraints must rely on luck in the succession of rulers, while a rule-bound system tries to make good government less dependent on personal character. The distinction between good and bad autocracy is precisely why Fukuyama refuses to equate administrative performance with liberal institutions. A regime can deliver peace, infrastructure, and low taxation without accountability. The problem appears across generations, when competent rulers cannot guarantee equally competent successors and society lacks a lawful mechanism for correcting failure. Part 4. Accountable Government. Chapter 22. The Rise of Political Accountability. Political accountability is the third component of modern political order. It exists when rulers must answer to organized social actors rather than merely consult them at their pleasure. Europe's path toward accountability was deeply connected to the lateness of its state building. By the time kings tried to centralize power in the 15th through 17th centuries, European society already contained strong aristocracies, cities, churches, legal traditions, estates, and corporate groups. Monarchs therefore confronted opponents who possessed their own resources and claims to legitimacy. Fukuyama warns against Whig history, the story that treats England's constitutional evolution as an inevitable march toward modern democracy. European countries started from similar feudal conditions, but produced sharply different outcomes. France and Spain developed patrimonial forms of absolutism. Hungary preserved aristocratic constitutionalism but allowed the state itself to become weak. Russia developed far stronger absolutism. England combined a relatively capable state with institutions of representation. These outcomes must be compared rather than ranked as stages on one predetermined path. War again drives much of the story. European monarchs needed larger armies and greater revenues as military technology changed. Raising taxes forced rulers to negotiate with estates and representative bodies. Whether these negotiations produced accountability depended on the balance of power between the crown and organized social groups. A monarch who could divide elites, buy offices, or impose serfdom might centralize without becoming accountable. Elites strong enough to resist the ruler might instead paralyze the state for their own benefit. The desired outcome is therefore not simply a weak king. Fukuyama's central framework is a balance between state and society. Too much state power produces absolutism. Too much oligarchic social power can produce weak government and elite privilege. Accountable government requires enough social organization to constrain the state while preserving enough state capacity to provide public goods. Fukuyama's framework for European state building can be imagined as a balance between two axes. On one side stands the central government, trying to monopolize coercion and taxation. On the other stands organized society, nobles, towns, churches, estates, and later broader social classes. Where the state overwhelms society, absolutism results. Where society overwhelms the state, oligarchy or political fragmentation can result. Accountable government appears only when neither side can simply eliminate the other, and both are pushed toward durable bargaining institutions. The prior existence of European law was crucial because it supplied a language in which social groups could present resistance as defense of legitimate rights, rather than rebellion for private advantage. This is one reason Europe's late state formation produced possibilities absent from China, where a strong imperial state had consolidated long before comparable independent corporations could emerge. Europe's fragmentation, often treated as a weakness compared with unified China, thus became a source of later institutional diversity. No single ruler could easily destroy every rival center of authority. Competition among monarchies also allowed people, capital, and ideas to move across borders, reducing the ability of one government to impose a permanent political settlement on the whole civilization. Chapter 23. Rente-seekers. France demonstrates how state building can become entangled with patrimonialism. The Bourbon monarchy inherited a fragmented kingdom with regional privileges, separate laws, powerful nobles, and offices that had increasingly become private property. Chronic warfare produced fiscal crises, but the crown lacked the administrative machinery and political authority to tax society uniformly. One response was the sale of offices. Positions in taxation, finance, justice, and administration could be purchased and often inherited. This provided the monarchy with immediate cash, but converted public authority into private property. Office holders acquired legal rights to revenues and could resist later efforts at reform. The state thus strengthened itself in the short term by creating entrenched interests that weakened it in the long term. The monarchy also used intendants, officials appointed from the center and sent into the provinces without deep local ties. They allowed Richelieu, Mazarin, Louis XIV, and their successors to bypass older venal offices and exercise greater central control. Yet France never became as administratively coherent as its absolutist image suggests. The crown remained constrained by legal privileges and had to manipulate courts and jurisdictions rather than simply govern through raw coercion. Potential opponents of absolutism failed to create durable accountability because French elites understood liberty largely as privilege. Nobles defended exemptions from taxation. Office holders defended purchased jurisdictions. Provinces defended local rights. These groups could resist royal power individually, but struggled to unite around general principles applicable to the whole society. The crown exploited those divisions. Fukuyama describes Ancien regime France as a rent-seeking society. Political energy flowed toward capturing offices and exemptions rather than producing public goods. Privileges became assets whose owners had a rational interest in preserving them even when they made the state fiscally dysfunctional. The monarchy could neither tax efficiently nor abolish the privileges that prevented efficient taxation. This institutional rigidity contributed to the crisis ending in the French Revolution. The venality of office reveals the fiscal trap in especially clear form. Selling a judgeship, tax office, or administrative post allowed the crown to convert future government revenues into cash today. But the buyer then possessed a legally protected asset and expected to recover the purchase through fees or income. When the monarchy later wanted to reorganize administration, it faced owners who demanded compensation. What looked like state strengthening, therefore, accumulated a mountain of private claims inside the state itself. The French elite's concept of liberty reinforced the problem because liberty meant exemption, freedom from attacks, protection of a province's customary rights, ownership of an office, or noble status. Few groups wanted an impersonal state that would eliminate special treatment, because their social position depended on special treatment. By the 18th century, almost every reform threatened someone's property-like privilege. The monarchy was strong enough to irritate everyone but too weak to remake the system. The French case also clarifies Fukuyama's definition of political decay. France did not decay because its institutions disappeared. They became too entrenched. Offices, tax exemptions, courts, noble rights, and regional privileges continued to function exactly because people valued them and because owners defended them as property. The state accumulated layers of institutions that had once helped solve fiscal or political problems, but later contradicted one another. Reformers could identify the dysfunction intellectually, yet still fail politically, because every rationalization created identifiable losers. The result was a dysfunctional equilibrium. Nearly everyone recognized that the fiscal system was unsustainable, but the groups capable of blocking reform were more organized than the diffuse public that would benefit from it. Revolution eventually destroyed the equilibrium through violence, rather than gradual institutional adjustment. The French trajectory is especially important because absolutism and state weakness coexisted. Versailles projected royal grandeur, but grandeur should not be confused with administrative capacity. The crown could interfere with individuals while still lacking a uniform tax base or an impersonal civil service. Fukuyama uses this distinction to show why measuring state strength by visible coercion alone is misleading. A modern state is powerful because it can implement general rules consistently, not because a ruler can arbitrarily override particular people. Chapter 24. Patrimonialism crosses the Atlantic. Spain followed a related path and transmitted many of its political institutions to Latin America. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, the completion of the Reconquista, and overseas expansion created the appearance of an extraordinarily powerful monarchy. American silver and imperial possessions made Spain a major European power. Yet the fiscal and administrative foundations of that power remain fragile. The Spanish crown faced strong local privileges and representative institutions, particularly in different historic kingdoms. Rather than build a uniform tax state, it relied heavily on particular regions and on increasingly complex borrowing. Imperial revenues encouraged repeated fiscal crises and bankruptcies. Like France, Spain raised money by selling offices and privileges, gradually patrimonializing administration. The conquest of the Americas initially allowed what Fukuyama calls greenfield institution building. Because Spanish conquerors were not simply inheriting European feudal structures, the crown could create audiencias, viceroyalties, municipalities, and administrative jurisdictions on a relatively clean institutional terrain. Some early colonial arrangements therefore looked more centralized and modern than contemporary European government. Over time, however, the political habits of Spain crossed the Atlantic. Offices became venal, local elites captured administration, and large landed estates developed. The latifundia concentrated economic and social power in oligarchic families. Colonial society also incorporated racial and status hierarchies that survived political independence. Fukuyama uses this history to explain recurring features of Latin American politics: personalism, patronage, concentrated landholding, weak universalistic administration, and the tendency to incorporate new groups through particular bargains rather than impersonal rules. Modern unions, businesses, indigenous movements, and other social actors have often been accommodated by granting benefits to organized constituencies, reproducing the logic of a patrimonial state even under democratic forms. The colonial transfer also helps explain why independence alone could not erase Latin America's institutional inheritance. New republics removed the Spanish crown but inherited concentrated land, social hierarchy, weakly impersonal administration, and elites accustomed to treating offices as channels of private benefit. Fukuyama does not argue that colonial history mechanically determined later outcomes. New actors repeatedly entered politics, and countries varied enormously. His claim is that institutional patterns shape the repertoire through which new demands are handled. Instead of reorganizing the state around universal rules, governments often incorporated workers, business groups, regional leaders, or indigenous communities through particularistic bargains. This can stabilize politics temporarily while making the state more complex and patrimonial. The persistence of inequality then reinforces clientelism because poor citizens have strong reasons to value immediate targeted benefits from a patron over abstract promises of universal policy. Large estates deepened the legacy because land was not merely an economic asset. It carried authority over dependent workers, local offices, credit, and political influence. Independents often transferred sovereignty from imperial officials to domestic elites whose social position had been formed under colonial rule. In many countries, elections later operated on top of these unequal structures. Fukuyama's argument is not that Latin America lacked democracy, but that democracy entered a political environment where citizens possessed dramatically unequal access to patrons and state resources. This helps explain why clientelism could coexist with competitive elections. A poor voter offered a job, food, or access to a public service may rationally support a patron, even when the broader effect is to preserve an impersonal state's weakness. The Spanish-American case also demonstrates institutional path dependence. Once land, office, and social status become concentrated together, later economic change does not automatically separate them. Families with wealth can influence administration, administrative influence protects wealth, and both can shape elections. Reform therefore requires more than replacing office holders. It must alter the rules through which private advantage is converted into public authority, a process that is politically difficult, because the beneficiaries of the old system are usually the actors best organized to defend it. Chapter 25. East of the Elbe. Eastern Europe provides a warning that limiting central government is not the same thing as creating freedom. West of the Elbe, medieval serfdom gradually weakened as peasants obtained stronger rights and labor became more mobile. East of the Elbe, the early modern period produced a, quote, second serfdom. Landlords tightened control over peasants in response to commercial opportunities and the political strength of noble estates. Hungary is Fukuyama's key example. Its nobility possessed strong constitutional privileges and representative institutions capable of constraining the crown. On a superficial reading, this looks like an early form of liberty. But the rights defended by the political nation belonged overwhelmingly to nobles, not peasants. A cohesive aristocracy could use constitutional mechanisms to prevent taxation, weaken royal administration, and preserve domination over the rural population. The Ottoman military threat exposed the cost of this arrangement. Hungary needed a stronger central state capable of organizing defense. Reforming rulers such as Matthias Corvinus temporarily increased state capacity, but noble resistance prevented the consolidation of those gains. After his death, oligarchic power returned. The Hungarian state was ultimately too weak to defend itself effectively against the Ottomans. The case shows why Fukuyama rejects the simple equation of civil society with freedom. A strong society can consist of oligarchs defending their privileges against both ruler and common people. Constitutional constraints can produce paralysis rather than liberal government, when the state lacks enough autonomy to act in the general interest. Freedom requires a strong state restrained by law and accountability, not merely an executive too weak to challenge elites. The divergence in serfdom also shows how economic opportunity interacts with political power. Growing Western European demand for grain created profitable markets for Eastern landlords. Where nobles controlled local justice and possessed collective political strength, they could respond by tightening labor obligations rather than by raising wages. Peasants became less free at the same historical moment when peasants farther west were escaping serfdom. Markets, therefore, did not automatically produce freedom. Their effects depended on existing institutions and the distribution of coercive power. Hungary's noble constitution protected exactly the class able to benefit from this system. Fukuyama uses the case to reject romantic accounts of civil society. An organized social group can defend liberty for its own members while imposing bondage on others. Liberal accountability requires that political constraints eventually become general rules, not merely corporate privileges for those strong enough to bargain with the sovereign. Hungary therefore supplies the mirror image of Russia. In Hungary, organized elites constrained the state too successfully. In Russia, the state and elite cooperated to constrain society below them. Neither arrangement produced the balanced accountability Fukuyama regards as the desirable outcome. Chapter 26. Toward a more perfect absolutism. Russia developed in nearly the opposite direction. The early political center around Kiev was shattered by Mongol conquest. Later, Muscovy expanded under conditions of military insecurity, sparse settlement, and competition with neighboring powers. Moscow's rulers gradually absorbed rival principalities and built an increasingly centralized state. Fukuyama emphasizes that Russian absolutism was not culturally predetermined. Novgorod and other Russian polities had contained representative or republican institutions that reveal paths not ultimately taken. The central bargain behind Muscovite state-building linked monarch and service nobility. The ruler needed cavalry, administrators, and military service. Nobles required dependable control over labor and land. Because peasants could flee across an enormous territory, land grants were of limited value, unless landlords could also prevent workers from leaving. The state therefore progressively restricted peasant mobility, culminating in serfdom. Fukuyama describes the arrangement as a peasant-owning cartel enforced by the monarchy on behalf of the service elite. Peter the Great intensified this system while trying to modernize Russia militarily and administratively. He reorganized government, built a navy, imported European techniques, and created the table of ranks, which tied noble status more closely to state service. These reforms made Russia a major European power and weakened some older hereditary arrangements. Yet modernization from above did not create an autonomous rule of law or accountable society. It strengthened the state while preserving coercive control over peasants. After Peter, noble service obligations were gradually relaxed while serfdom remained. This altered the original exchange. Elites retained domination over peasants without bearing the same burdens to the state. Catherine the Great further consolidated noble privilege. By the late 18th century, Russia had achieved a more complete absolutism than France or Spain because organized social actors were less capable of constraining the monarchy. Fukuyama nevertheless rejects historical fatalism. Russia later experienced periods of reform and liberalization. His point is institutional rather than cultural. The sequence of Mongol rule, Muscovite consolidation, military pressure, weak independent cities, and the alliance between crown and service nobility created unusually favorable conditions for absolutism. Muscovy's geography and military environment made this bargain especially durable. The state faced competition from steppe powers, Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and other rivals, while governing a relatively thinly settled territory. Soldiers had to be supported with land, but land without labor generated little revenue. Restricting peasant movement, therefore, became a fiscal and military policy, as well as a concession to nobles. The monarchy gained a service class. The nobles gained control over peasants. Peter's reforms increased the administrative demands placed on elites, yet they were imposed through the same top-down state that protected serfdom. The table of ranks created avenues for talented commoners to enter the nobility through service, which was a genuine move toward merit, but it did not create impersonal equality before law. Russia thus modernized important state functions without developing the independent legal and social institutions that had constrained rulers in Western Europe. Fukuyama sees this as an example of modernization that strengthens absolutism rather than dissolving it. The Russian path also underscores the importance of sequencing. Once serfdom and service nobility became pillars of state power, later reformers inherited organized interests tied to those institutions. Modernization had to proceed through structures created by earlier military necessities. Chapter 27: Taxation and Representation. England's constitutional development becomes clearer when placed beside the failures of France, Spain, Hungary, and Russia. England's kings also tried to centralize power, raise taxes, manipulate offices, and defeat opponents. What distinguished England was not unusually virtuous rulers, but the ability of important social groups to act together through institutions whose legitimacy had developed over centuries. Fukuyama traces this solidarity partly to England's early social structure. Extended kinship had weakened unusually early, and local political organization existed before the Norman conquest through shires, hundreds, and assemblies. After 1066, the monarchy built a strong state and a national legal system without completely destroying local institutions. The common law gave both crown and subjects a shared framework of legitimacy. The rise of towns and a commercially active bourgeoisie added another organized constituency. Fukuyama treats the existence of a middle class as important but not sufficient. Merchants and gentry had to find political mechanisms through which they could cooperate with one another and with aristocrats. Parliament gradually provided that arena. By the 13th century, English parliaments met with unusual regularity and acquired a role in consenting to taxation. Fiscal conflict became decisive. War required money, but the crown could not simply tax at will. Parliament used its control over revenue to demand redress of grievances. Because representatives of different estates increasingly bargained within the same institution, they developed common interests against arbitrary royal taxation. This was very different from France, where privileges and offices often divided potential opponents of the crown. The Stuart period transformed these tensions into open conflict over taxation, religion, prerogative, and the legal status of royal authority. Civil war, regicide, restoration, and renewed conflict eventually culminated in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 1689. James II was removed, and William and Mary accepted a political settlement that strengthened parliamentary control over taxation and government. Fukuyama resists the simple claim that 1688 suddenly invented democracy. The franchise remained narrow, corruption persisted, and oligarchic influence was considerable. The deeper change was institutional. The monarchy could no longer govern effectively without parliament, while the state itself remained capable of raising revenue, borrowing, fighting wars, and enforcing law. England therefore approached the balanced combination Fukuyama has been tracing throughout the book: a strong state, a respected rule of law, and an increasingly institutionalized form of accountability. This settlement also had economic consequences. Credible limits on arbitrary confiscation and parliamentary control over finance strengthened public credit and private confidence. But Fukuyama, again, rejects reductionism. English constitutionalism was not created simply because merchants demanded property rights. It emerged from the interaction of law, religion, social structure, war, state building, and collective political organization accumulated over a very long period. The book stops on the eve of the American and French revolutions because, by this point, the core institutional package of modern liberal government had appeared in recognizable form. Britain was not the only route. The Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and other societies assembled similar components through different histories. Once created, however, the combination became an extraordinarily powerful model for later political development. The English state also solved a problem that had trapped France: public finance. Once Parliament gained a credible role in approving taxation and supervising government, lenders could believe that debts incurred by the state would survive the personal fortunes of a particular monarch. The post-1688 financial settlement supported a funded national debt and stronger public credit, enabling Britain to mobilize extraordinary resources for war. Accountability, therefore, did not simply weaken the crown. By making taxation and borrowing more legitimate, it ultimately strengthened the state. Fukuyama sees this as one of the most important paradoxes of constitutional government. Rulers who accept constraints can gain greater long-run capacity because citizens and creditors trust the institutions through which power is exercised. The outcome was not inevitable. It depended on centuries of state-building before the decisive constitutional struggle. The comparison with France is therefore not that English elites were less self-interested. They defended property and privilege vigorously. The difference was that bargaining through Parliament gradually converted private demands into rules applying to a wider political community. Institutionalized negotiation made it possible for the state to obtain resources, while subjects obtained credible limits on royal discretion. Accountability emerged from conflict among organized interests, not from the disappearance of interest. Chapter 28. Why accountability? Why absolutism? Fukuyama now compares the European cases directly. The key variable is not simply whether society is strong or the state is strong. Political outcomes depend on the relative organization of both sides and on whether social groups can overcome collective action problems. Russia achieved strong absolutism because the monarchy faced fewer autonomous corporations capable of resisting it, possessed military reasons for centralization, and built an alliance with a service nobility that benefited from the subordination of peasants. France and Spain developed weaker forms of absolutism. Their crowns became powerful but were trapped by entrenched privileges and patrimonial offices. They could dominate many subjects while remaining incapable of rationalizing taxation or disciplining their own elites. Hungary shows the opposite failure. The nobility successfully constrained the monarchy but did so primarily to preserve aristocratic privileges. The state became too weak to provide collective goods, including effective military defense. Accountability to a narrow oligarchy was therefore not equivalent to liberal government. Why did England avoid both outcomes? Fukuyama points to a relatively broad solidarity among aristocracy, gentry, urban groups, and other property holders. Parliament provided a common institutional arena. Law gave resistance to the crown a language of legitimacy. A strong monarchy had already built national institutions, so defeating absolutism did not require destroying the state itself. England's success consisted in balancing institutions that elsewhere developed separately or in the wrong proportions. Yet England cannot be treated as the one universal road to modernity. Fukuyama returns to the metaphor of getting to Denmark by describing Denmark's very different path. Danish absolutism was initially strong, but later social and political changes produced peaceful liberalization and accountable government. Historical accidents, international pressures, class relations, and national institutions differed greatly from England's. What matters is the eventual combination, rather than a single sequence, that every country must repeat. The comparison reinforces Fukuyama's central methodological argument. Political development is path-dependent. Early institutions shape later possibilities, but they do not mechanically determine them. Similar starting points can produce different outcomes, and societies can reach comparable modern arrangements through very different routes. The comparative lesson is that political liberty depends on organization, not merely preferences. Many French or Russian subjects may have disliked arbitrary power, but they lacked the cross-class institutions that allowed English groups to act collectively. Conversely, Hungarian nobles were highly organized, but sought a narrow freedom compatible with peasant subordination. Accountability becomes liberal only when organized groups expand the circle of people whose rights count, and when the state remains strong enough to enforce those rights generally. Part 5. Toward a Theory of Political Development. Chapter 29. Political Development and Political Decay. Having completed the historical comparisons, Fukuyama draws the theoretical lessons together. Human politics rests on a common biological foundation. People are naturally social, favor kin, reciprocate favors, create hierarchies, follow norms, and seek recognition. These propensities make cooperation possible, but also create persistent obstacles to impersonal government. Patrimonialism is not an archaic defect that modernization automatically eliminates. It is the natural tendency to use power on behalf of family and personal associates, and it continually reappears when institutions fail to restrain it. Ideas must be treated as independent causes as well. Religious doctrines, moral beliefs, legal concepts, and theories of legitimacy can reshape institutions even when they do not correspond neatly to material interests. Ancestor worship helped sustain tribes. Brahmanic religion constrained the Indian state. Christianity weakened extended kinship in Europe. Legal and religious ideas helped create institutions capable of limiting rulers. Political development cannot therefore be reduced to economics, technology, or class struggle. Fukuyama compares institutional evolution to biological evolution. Societies generate variation in political arrangements, and competition selects among them. War is one powerful selection mechanism because states that mobilize resources poorly can be conquered by states that do so better. Imitation spreads successful institutions, but political evolution is not a smooth process of optimization. Institutions can arise for one purpose and later be used for another, like biological spandrels. Historical accidents and contingent sequences matter enormously. Institutions themselves are stable, valued, recurring patterns of behavior. A modern state, following Weber, must not merely monopolize legitimate violence. It should be organized through specialized, hierarchical, impersonal administration. That impersonality is hard to establish because it conflicts with deeply rooted human preferences for kin and reciprocal relationships. China's legalists attacked the family politically. Muslim rulers used military slaves. European societies weakened kinship through the church and later built bureaucratic states. Different civilizations therefore solve the same underlying problem through different mechanisms. Fukuyama then restates his three dimensions of political order. The state concentrates power and provides collective goods. The rule of law limits power by subjecting rulers to rules not entirely under their control. Accountability ensures that government responds to organized society. None is intrinsically sufficient. A weak state cannot enforce rights. An unconstrained state can become arbitrary. Accountability without state capacity can become oligarchic paralysis. Political decay occurs through at least two broad mechanisms. First, institutions fail to adapt when the external environment changes. Rules created for earlier conditions remain in place because people value them, and because organizations develop routines around them. Second, patrimonial interests gradually capture impersonal institutions. Elites use political influence to convert public authority into private benefits. Han aristocrats sheltering estates from taxation and French officeholders protecting venal privileges are historically different versions of the same process. The persistence of dysfunctional institutions is not mysterious. Every institutional arrangement creates beneficiaries. Reform threatens rents, status, and power, so groups that gain from the existing order organize to defend it. Political systems can therefore remain trapped in dysfunctional equilibria even when many people would benefit from change. Severe crisis, especially war or fiscal breakdown, can disrupt such equilibria, but violence is costly and its consequences unpredictable. There is therefore no automatic march toward Denmark. Modern institutions are historically rare achievements, and they can decay. The same human tendencies that produce patrimonial politics in ancient societies remain active inside contemporary bureaucracies and democracies. The task of political development is not to abolish human nature, but to create rules and incentives that channel it toward impersonal public purposes. The evolutionary analogy also has limits. Political institutions are transmitted culturally rather than genetically, so societies can copy a successful arrangement without waiting for generations of biological selection. They can also redesign rules consciously, but institutional borrowing is constrained by power and legitimacy. A constitutional provision that works in one country may fail in another if the groups expected to obey it have different incentives. Variation can therefore be intentional, while selection remains intensely political. Fukuyama's historical comparisons are meant to identify recurring mechanisms without pretending that development follows a deterministic law. Fukuyama's theory is consequently anti-teleological. Selection may reward effective institutions in a particular environment, but there is no final political form immune to decay. A bureaucracy that is impersonal today can be captured tomorrow. A constitutional rule can become obsolete. An elite can transform public institutions into sources of private rent. Development has direction only relative to specific institutional problems. The state, law, and accountability are achievements that must continually be reproduced. Chapter 30. Political Development, Then and Now. The final chapter explains why the pre-modern history in this volume cannot simply be projected onto contemporary developing countries. Around 1800, the Industrial Revolution changed the relationship among politics, economics, and society. Before that transition, most societies lived under broadly Malthusian conditions. Technological improvements could temporarily increase output, but population growth tended eventually to absorb the gains. Sustained increases in per capita productivity were exceptional. In a Malthusian world, politics was largely zero-sum. Wealthy people had few opportunities to invest capital in activities that produce continuous technological growth. The most reliable path to greater resources was often control of land, offices, taxation, or conquest. This made the state especially important economically. A ruler who built military power could acquire territory and taxpayers. Elites naturally sought political rents because political power was one of the principal means of accumulating wealth. The Industrial Revolution created the possibility of continuous intensive growth. Scientific knowledge, technological innovation, capital accumulation, new forms of business organization, literacy in institutions such as patent and property law allowed productivity to increase without relying primarily on territorial expansion. Economic growth then transformed social structure. Urbanization, education, communications, and occupational specialization produced new groups that could organize politically and demand recognition. The dimensions of development therefore became much more tightly interconnected. A capable state can provide education, infrastructure, law, and public health that encourage economic growth. Growth can expand state revenues and administrative resources. A larger middle class can demand accountability. Social mobilization can destabilize political systems that fail to adapt. The sequence differs dramatically from ancient China or medieval Europe, where political institutions could evolve for centuries without sustained economic modernization. South Korea illustrates a favorable modern sequence. After the Korean War, it inherited a relatively strong state, shaped by Confucian traditions and Japanese colonial administration. Authoritarian governments used state capacity to promote rapid industrialization and education. Economic growth transformed society and created a larger, more organized middle class. Social mobilization later pressed the political system toward democracy. The case does not prove that authoritarianism is necessary for development, but it shows how modern growth can create feedback loops unavailable in a Malthusian economy. Contemporary development also takes place in an international system that transmits ideas, capital, technology, and institutional models rapidly. Poor countries no longer have to rediscover bureaucratic organization or constitutional forms independently. They can copy laws, ministries, central banks, elections, and regulatory agencies from societies that developed them over centuries. But formal imitation does not guarantee function. Institutions imported into societies with different distributions of power or social norms can operate very differently from their models. This returns Fukuyama to the problem introduced in the first chapter. Successful liberal democracy requires a strong, coherent state and an equally organized society capable of imposing accountability. If the state is weak, elections can distribute patronage without producing government capacity. If society is weak, a capable state can remain authoritarian. Rule of law requires institutions whose legitimacy is strong enough to bind both rulers and citizens. The international environment can alter the balance. Opposition movements can obtain ideas, funds, training, or support from abroad, while authoritarian rulers can also receive outside assistance. Economic growth can strengthen both states and social groups. There is no universal sequence by which modernization must end in liberal democracy. Fukuyama closes by looking ahead to questions that require the second volume. China has built a strong state and achieved extraordinary economic growth without Western-style accountability. Whether social and economic modernization will ultimately alter that political structure remains open. Other developing countries face the opposite problem. They have elections and social mobilization, but lack capable states. Understanding their prospects requires studying political development after the Industrial Revolution. The historical journey of this volume has therefore cleared the ground. The state, rule of law, and accountable government arose separately, for different reasons, in different civilizations. Modern liberal democracy combines them, but history provides no guarantee that they will remain balanced. Political development is a continual struggle to adapt institutions to changing conditions, while resisting the recurrent pull of patrimonialism and institutional decay. This difference explains why contemporary development can be both faster and more unstable. Economic and social modernization can advance within decades, while political institutions retain structures formed under very different conditions. A rapidly educated and urbanized population may demand participation faster than a state can develop competent bureaucracies. Alternatively, rapid growth may give an authoritarian state additional resources with which to resist accountability. Modernization therefore multiplies possible sequences rather than imposing a single endpoint. The central analytical task is to examine how state capacity, law, social mobilization, and accountability interact in each case, rather than assume that economic growth automatically produces liberal democracy. This also changes the meaning of sequencing. Historically, China built the state long before accountability, while parts of Europe developed law and organized social constraints before fully centralized government. Contemporary countries can encounter all three models at once through global diffusion, yet formal adoption may outpace underlying capacity. The practical question is not whether a country has a ministry, court, or election in name, but whether each institution is embedded deeply enough to perform its function when powerful actors would prefer that it not.